Oh, good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church here in Salt Lake City. Wonderful to have you all here, although I do confess I wish there were more people here this morning from Norway. That would be... it would be great. I'm not casting any aspersions on Magna or Tooele. But, you know, they're not as happy as people are from, say, Oslo. Once again, our president offered another piece of evidence that racism dwells not only below the surface, but is blatantly justified as policy, be it immigration, health care, federal appointments to the bench, voter suppression, the safety net for the rising number of America's poor. On this weekend, celebrating and honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we feel a chilly realism while looking at our current state of affairs in race relations. We have not moved the needle. The dream remains but a dream. And the arc of the moral universe is long, still resisting to bend towards justice. Symbol of light and of knowledge, symbol of warmth and freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. May we open our service, turning our hymn books, please, to number 131.
The streets of downtown Birmingham, Alabama, and the steps of its black churches are hallowed ground. In all my study of the civil rights movement, the images that have most moved my heart are those of women and men descending the steps of those churches and spilling out onto the streets to march, dressed in their Sunday best. Shined shoes, white gloves, matching handbags. Their starched shirts and their nylons torn by the teeth of dogs. Their twin-set cardigans soaked by high-power water hoses. They were dressed in their best because they had been in church, making their sacrifice to God, purifying their hearts before embarking on the most sacred of endeavors. And when they came out onto the streets, hearts pounding, they were still in church, still singing the songs of the freedom that other human beings cannot take from one another. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. The dignity of being free simply because you are human and you answer to no other power save that of the Most High. That is the gift that those foot soldiers gave to the world and that was distilled into the person and character of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said it this way: one's dignity may be assaulted, vandalized, cruelly mocked, but it can never be taken away unless it is surrendered. With their commitment to behaving from a place of unassailable dignity, the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement convicted the conscience of the world. Let us now call them down as a mighty cloud of witnesses as we join together in prayer, meditation, or reflection. Holy One of Justice, help us today to commit to live from dignity, to adorn ourselves in grace and wisdom, to never allow the mud of vengeance or spite to spatter our clothing, to walk with our heads held high, knowing that we answer to you alone. And yet, soften our hearts, convict our conscience, teach us that tribalism, self-righteousness, and complacency are the henchmen of racism, and there is not one who is blameless, no, not one. Let us then be not only dignified, but humble, serving others without ego, and growing together as one people, as is our true nature. Amen. In April 1963, a group of 8 white Alabama clergymen wrote a letter to the editor of a local newspaper with the title, "A Call to Unity," denouncing the efforts of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to organize anti-racist protests in Birmingham. Meanwhile, Dr. King sat in a roach-infested jail cell where a friend smuggled in a copy of the newspaper for him to read this letter. His own letter of response from that jail cell has become a sacred text of those who love freedom the world over. And it is from that letter that I read a few words to you now. My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas, but since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy speeds toward gaining a cup of coffee at the lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into an abyss of despair. I must make an honest confession to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who's more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. More and more, I feel that people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity.
Thank you, choir. Thank you for bringing the Spirit upon this house this morning. It was beautiful. Just a couple of brief announcements. First one actually goes hand in hand, and that is everybody who's interested in helping us as a volunteer as we turn to becoming a sanctuary church. Please head out to the sanctuary table after the services and see of all the opportunities you have to roll up your sleeves and work to bring a little more justice to this world. Also take a look. There will be a training session, and just read the sanctuary volunteers portion of the order of service to find out where you want to fit in. And that is kind of coupled with the congregational meeting that will be held here February 4th following the service, in which we will make our sanctuary policy official. And so that's going to be an important and a brief meeting for everyone to attend. The last announcement is that a week from Tuesday, that's the 23rd of January at 7 o'clock right here in Elliott Hall, Monica and I are going to be facilitating a UU orientation class. It's a one-time deal. It's a wonderful opportunity for new people or newish people or those who have a sliver of newness in them who want to learn more about Unitarian Universalist history and philosophy and theology, and you've got questions. A great time to meet and to learn and get to know one another a lot better. Please sign up if you can, especially if you need childcare. That would be a great help to us. And so now the offering will gratefully be received, a chance to greet one another and bid each other a fine good morning. Ever since Thomas Jefferson inserted into the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, there's been a division, a real hard division, among those who cling to the myth of American egalitarianism and those who experience the hard reality of what it actually means being black in America. Now, I do not purport to know the black experience, and I trust that every Caucasian here today will admit the same. We may look upon American injustice towards African Americans with a sense of shame, a feeling of guilt, and a deep understanding that not only is this injustice inherently wrong, but it constitutes a legitimate crime against humanity. Still, we can't actually feel the rage coursing through our veins. We may imagine we can, but no, we can't. Why are police officers rarely charged for killing young, unarmed black men? And when they are charged, why do juries rarely convict? The damning videos taken from the dashboard cameras mounted on the police cars lead to really an unequivocal conclusion that black lives do not matter. There's a history that ties into this discrepancy between all men are created equal and black lives do not matter. There's a discrepancy between lofty notions of democracy, egalitarianism, and individual freedom clashing with the reality of black incarceration, voter suppression, and the enslavement of black people. For African Americans, Ta-Nehisi Coates reminds us, the war did not commence in 1861, but in 1661. when the Virginia colony began passing America's first black codes. These charter documents make explicitly clear that a slave society has rendered blacks to a permanent servile class and whites to a mass aristocracy. So from 1661 to 1861, over those next 2 centuries, the vast majority of the country's blacks were robbed of their labor and subjected to constant and capricious violence. They were raped and whipped at the pleasure of their owners. Can you imagine owning another person? Slavery did not mean merely coerced labor, sexual assault, and torture, but the constant threat of having a portion or the whole of your family consigned to oblivion. In every conceivable regard, slavery was a war on the black family. Ibrahim Kenzie, a professor of history at American University, reminds us of a 1906 Teddy Roosevelt speech to Congress, in which Roosevelt said, "The greatest existing cause of lynching is the perpetration by black men of the hideous crime of rape." He also said, "When black criminality ceases, black death will cease." So here in part lies the rage that really bypasses white lineage, although we may be sympathetic. In American history, it was always assumed that it was the African Americans themselves who were violent, not the slave owner, not the lynch mob, not the cop. There is an African American rage that spills forth not only in the streets throughout our country, but also manifest in the arts. Most recently, the film Mudbound, which is hard to watch, takes place in Mississippi immediately following the Second World War. A black soldier who fought overseas returns to his native Mississippi thinking that fighting for the freedoms of his country would somehow matter. But the mores of the town where his family lived, the mores reinforced by the Ku Klux Klan, demonstrated that all men are not created equal. Even if they are prepared to lay down their lives for that principle, black lives do not matter. And in the popular historical novel, which I believe reached the bestseller, the top of the bestseller list of the New York Times, the book The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, the brutality inflicted by slave owners upon the servants, from whippings to amputations to selling some members of a family to another plantation, unmasks the naked truth of the insufferable inhumanity visited upon the black population in our country. You know, it is actually impossible to even begin to comprehend such a degree of cruelty. 50 years ago, an extraordinary black leader was slain in Memphis. 55 years ago, he expressed a dream he had which echoed Jefferson's haunting words that all men are created equal. But in the dream, listen to his dream, that was actually the case. everyone and their children would flourish when this nation will, in his words, rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream speech in August of 1963, the Washington Mall, is remembered for his appeal to a common humanity, his appeal to religious principles, and the need for love to drive out prejudice. But what many people conveniently forget is his solid critique, in that speech, his solid critique of the drug. He called it a drug, the drug called gradualism, which he condemned much like he did in the letter from a Birmingham jail. And he pointed out that the reason tens of thousands of people were gathered around the reflecting pool between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial was to dramatize, his words, to dramatize a shameful condition. He described black America in that dream speech as being crippled by the chains of discrimination and referred to African Americans as exiles in their own land. Dr. King held no punches. He juxtaposed the egalitarian creed of this nation with slaves, again in his words, slaves seared in the flames of withering injustice. And what really stood out for me as I reread the speech was his reference to the horrors of police brutality. More than half a century later, a quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, Colin Kaepernick, took a knee during the playing of the national anthem rather than stand in line with the rest of the players, placing his hand over his heart. He felt compelled to protest the contradiction between the American myth of equality juxtaposed with that same shameful condition raised by Dr. King in 1963. Specifically, according to Kaepernick, he took the knee to protest racial inequality and police brutality. Now, this weekend, many Americans will remember Dr. King through a haze of nostalgia. He was eloquent and courageous, a leader who brought change, we think, brought change to the well-being of African Americans. We want to believe that somehow Dr. King's hand was on the lever that changed race relations in America. We like to remember Dr. King as though he were a spokesman for the myth of American egalitarianism. And Colin Kaepernick took a knee in order to wake us up to the reality that persists 50 years after Dr. King's murder. The generations upon generations upon generations of exploitation, struggle, discrimination are not behind us. African Americans are still perceived today as less than. And when we examine the political leadership in America today, we wonder if it's even possible to remove racism from the body of America. And I sure hope that Mia Love will finally wake up to the bigotry in her own party. The historian Edmund Morgan, in his seminal work, American Slavery, American Freedom, argues that reconciliation between the sin of slavery and the democratic ideal is pure myth. we like, enjoy, and want to believe in this myth of making progress. And although slavery ran contrary to America's stated precepts, it was slavery that allowed American democracy to exist in the first place. It was slavery that gifted much of the South with a working class that lived outside all protection and could be driven, beaten, and traded into generational perpetuity. Morgan continues, the ability to employ this labor on abundant land stolen from Native Americans formed a foundation for democratic equality among a people who came to see skin color and hair texture as defining features. I believe one of the most honest accounts of the so-called American ideal of equality was uttered by Jefferson Davis, who was president of the Confederacy. White men, he said, white men have an equality. White men have an equality resulting from a presence of a lower caste. He actually used that word caste. So white men have the equality, which came about through the presence of a lower caste, which cannot exist were white men to fill the positions occupied by the servile class. So Jefferson Davis made clear that slavery provided not merely the foundation of white economic prosperity, but the foundation of white social equality, and thus the foundation of American democracy. Now, Kaepernick is not to be mistaken for a great civil rights leader. First of all, the civil rights era has long passed, and the quarterback is not exactly known for his rhetorical style. But in much the same way as the Black Lives Matter movement, the emphasis remains on exposing the untruths of our nation's democratic myth. We have been sleepwalking with the assumption of living in what we call now a post-racial America, especially since the election of a black president. But the birther movement, remember? The birther movement, casting Obama as Kenyan or Muslim, which is to say, cast him as other. Birthism was a euphemism for the continuation of our racist past. The attempt to deny African Americans the rights entitled to other American citizens by dismissing the legitimacy of the first black president was part of organizing a constituency that has empowered white supremacy to regain a foothold in the American landscape. We are not the new country with equal opportunity that many feel was expressed in Dr. King's dream and has somehow come to pass. No. The fact is we have not overcome. And when the Super Bowl quarterback takes a knee during the playing of the national anthem, he's saying, we have not overcome because black lives still do not matter. And Americans, very sensitive about maintaining the democratic myth of equality, took the gesture of silently dropping a knee as meaning disrespect to our flag and country, lacking patriotism, and dissing the military. I wonder if all these Americans who have been so affronted by, or so insulted by the act of taking a knee during the national anthem, I wonder if they even know or realize the inherent racism in the Star-Spangled Banner itself. Now, we think that our national anthem is but a few lines, where in fact the third verse, written by Francis Scott Key, has been all but edited out Our schools teach us that Key was a prisoner on a British ship in the War of 1812. And he wrote his poem sitting in the back of that ship, watching American troops battle back an invading British army in Baltimore. What the schools avoid teaching us is that Francis Scott Key was an aristocratic prosecutor from Washington who maintained that blacks were intellectually inferior to whites. And what our schools further exclude from our education is the composition of the colonial Marines, a battalion of runaway slaves who joined with the British Royal Army in exchange for their freedom. On August 24th, 1815, when Key was a lieutenant at the Battle of Bladensburg, he ran into a battalion of the black colonial Marines who whipped the troops pretty badly under Key's leadership. Key, in fact, barely escaped with his life fleeing to Georgetown. It was a simple repudiation of white supremacy, much like Jesse Owens winning the gold medal during the Nazi Olympics in Berlin. As Francis Scott Key was inspired to write his poetry in 1816 while watching American troops fight the British in Baltimore, he surely did not forget his humiliation at the hands of the black battalion. There's a third verse in our national anthem, after all this business of being a land of the free and home of the brave. It was a purely racist account calling for the blood of former slaves. Imagine people had the audacity to fight for their freedom. We must also remember that Kaepernick was not the first to bring the race issue to the gridiron. Football was not incidental to the doctrine of white supremacy. In fact, it was one of the pillars on which that ideology rested. Because in the same year that King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, the University of Alabama was pressured to admit its first 2 black students. And it took another 7 years for Alabama to sign Wilbur Jackson, its first black recruit. And the legendary coach, Paul Bryant, did so while actually being sued by civil rights attorneys for failing to desegregate the team. The University of Georgia football team actually broke the color barrier in 1961, but refused to let a black player take the field until 1971. It took the Kennedy administration to interfere with the Washington Redskins in 1962 to finally let black players onto the field. In a battle with the Soviet Union to win the hearts and minds of the non-white developing world, it posed too much of an embarrassment or contradiction to have an all-white team playing in our nation's capital. And many of us will remember the difficulty of black quarterbacks breaking the color line. The resistance to a black quarterback ran through every professional team, built upon the dogma, of course, of white supremacy. No black player was considered sharp enough to serve as the field general, as the quarterback was referred to. The emergence of the black quarterback didn't happen until the 80s. Now, in the debate about the meaning of Kaepernick's protest, someone, somewhere, should have read that poem by Lucille Clifton. She was an African-American poet and poet laureate of the state of Maryland from 1979 to 1985. She wrote, They act like they don't love their country. No. What it is they found out their country don't love them. They act like they don't love their country. No. What it is they found out their country don't love them. So from the time Thomas Jefferson sparked the controversy that we are all created equal, to the present time, we have had a collision of meanings about being an American. Our nation was built on centuries of straight, white, male dominance. There are so many today who never tore down the whites only sign from the Jim Crow era. And then there are Americans who wonder if our nation might ever be lifted from its blighted history of racial horrors. We hope and pray that the future promises to bring the American character in line with Jefferson's ideal. But regarding the future of race relations in America today, frankly raises more doubt than faith. We urgently need to distinguish between the myth of freedom and the continuing injustice confronting black life in America. Now, Colin Kaepernick tried to wake us from our slumber, and since then, no team wants him to play for them. He hasn't thrown a single pass this entire season. Too controversial. He's paid the price for trying to shake us from the illusion of America being the land of the free, home of the brave. Dropping to one knee in the face of hypocrisy calls upon all of us to recognize perhaps our habitual habits of endorsing America's myth of freedom. Those who challenge the myth are not unpatriotic. They, or shall I say we, merely demand an honest accounting of why the forces working against the Jefferson notion of equality remains a structural part of America as we know it and experience it today. Amen. Can we conclude our service turning our hymn books to number 148, which was written actually by a former minister of our church, Jacob Trapp. So I think it holds maybe a little additional meaning. Hymn number 148. As we extinguish the chalice, may we close our service today with these words by A. Powell Davies, one of the more famous Unitarian ministers, especially when he had his ministry in Washington in the 1940s and 1950s. He said, "Here we are, all of us, upon this planet, bound together, living our lives between the briefness of the daylight and the dark. Kindred in this, each lighted by the same precarious, flickering flame of life. How does it happen that we're not kindred in all things? How strange and foolish are these walls of separation that divide us." Amen. David, thanks very much. Let's break for coffee, conversation, a quick reminder. Please be sure to visit the table for sanctuary signups. Take a look at a possible role that you can play in this. Also registering for the UU orientation. And I think that's about it. Thank you.